Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I'll get started. If any problems come up, as always, just let me know in the chat, and I'll hopefully see that and accommodate. So last week, or actually last class, which was 2 weeks ago, Ken had pointed out to me that our syllabus for that week told us we should cover 2 chapters, and I hadn't done that. I had only covered 1 chapter because I was following the pattern that I used in our previous last year's version of this class. So to accommodate that, we're covering 2 chapters today, and for reasons mostly of logic, I'm going to change a bit the order in which the text does things by covering chapters 7 and 9, which are radio and television, at the same time. To my mind, there's a strong logic to this because they're both broadcast technologies, because their historical development and their the policies that have been used to manage them have followed very similar patterns, and because they're both facing very similar problems in the current environment, I think it's better to deal with these 2 chapters together than any other 2 chapters. So that's what we're going to do today. I realize that I didn't make this clear in advance to everyone. I hope it doesn't cause any problems, but we'll move forward. Okay. So today we deal with broadcast communication, radio and television, starting with chapter 7, which is radio. To preface, I want to say I really, of all the technologies, of all the communication technologies that are most interesting to me personally, radio has always been my favorite, and I think it's for a few different reasons. Partly radio is the very first mass medium that creates the possibility for simultaneous communication with mass audiences. It's a medium that's very interesting because it was very much a medium promoted by hobbyists. A lot of competition. Not sure if competition is the right word. A lot of struggle in early radio over what this new medium would be. Would it be a 2-way form of communication, 1-way form of communication? Who would be using it? What would be the rules? And it's the first medium in which the technical limitations of distribution of the medium cause big concerns with regulation. In other words, print technologies can be, if you have a printing press, you print material, you have the money, you have the access to do that, you distribute it. It doesn't prevent anybody else from doing the same thing. With radio, however, because radio is delivered through the atmosphere, because of the way radio signals work, radio signals can interfere with one another very easily. And what it means is there's a strong need for some kind of regulation that creates priorities for society. How are we going to use what is ultimately a scarce resource? Because the radio spectrum can fill up very quickly with broadcast signals. Okay, so that's my own personal interest in this. Also, broadcast technologies in the United States have been and continue to be the historical record on radio and technology, continue to be a very interesting area for looking at competing priorities over what our communication media should do for us. Should communication media be public resources that promote democratic values and go so far as to try to ensure equal time and equal space for people who don't have financial resources to use those technologies? Or should broadcast technologies be primarily things that we use to conduct business and be governed by the priorities of business? So those are big underlying questions that have influenced the development of communication technologies in North America and worldwide. And the historical record on radio and also to a great extent television are still places we can turn for very interesting statements on the roles that communication technologies might or should play in our society, or our societies. Okay, so we'll start with concerns about technological innovation. Right? Every technology that we're looking at here, every form of communication that we're looking at here has a technological component. That's not to say that technology is the only concern, and far from it. But we do need to consider and be concerned with the role of technological innovation in new communications processes. Some precursors to radio. If you're all familiar with the notion of the semaphore, you may have seen, for example, when I was growing up, I don't know how common it is now, when I was growing up, I used to see movies with scenes from ships, naval conflicts, which might be from the times of pre-radio to right up until World War II. The use of semaphores, that's to say signaling flags that transmit messages from one place to another, is one of the forms of communication that was used to communicate at some distance. What this requires is a line of sight, right? In order to communicate through semaphore, through visual signals, you require either one clear line of sight with the person that you're communicating with, or a series of lines of sights with a series of people doing the communication. And this is a technique, a technology also that has been in use at least since the times of Julius Caesar. Another precursor to radio is the electrical telegraph. This is a form of transmission over wires of impulse signals that can be used to send coded messages. Now, this also you may be familiar from movies. And I recall when I was growing up, I had what we call a little walkie-talkie, a little two-way radio that had a button on it for tap, 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 Morse code. The techniques that were developed, the technologies developed for electrical impulse signals over telegraph, simply tapping to close a circuit and using that to send a signal over long distances were another important precursor to radio. The next innovation, big innovation, was the telephone, which was, of course, wired communication for much of its history, wired communication with voice. Now, one of the things that I like to point out about telephone is the telephone systems that we're used to now are systems that are mostly meant for one-to-one communication. We do have certainly the ability to set up conference calls, things like that, where many people are talking at once. But by far the dominant use of telephone communication is one-to-one communication, one person to another person. When telephone initially developed, this was actually not the first use of telephone. When telephone systems were initially developing, it was actually more common for systems to be set up for almost like broadcast. Telephone was envisioned early on as a medium that would work like a broadcast medium in which businesses, governments, other people with important things to say could actually broadcast out messages to large numbers of people at the same time. For a variety of reasons, this model didn't stick, and the individual model, the model of individual communication, private communications, one person to another person, became the dominant model with telephone. Wireless telegraphy developed in the 1880s. Heinrich Rudolf Hertz developed a method for short-range wireless transmission of signals. Now you notice most of our innovations, semaphore lines were from ancient times, but electrical telegraph, telephone, wireless telegraphy are happening in a relatively short period of time. One innovation building on the next innovation. Shortly after that, in the 1890s, Guglielmo Marconi developed possibility for wireless transmission over long distances. Now, previous to that, wireless transmission had been over short distances, very short-range transmission. Marconi was the first person to come up with a workable method for long-distance transmission. I'd like to point out here also, I haven't mentioned this in the slides, but we should be very much aware. Radio is very clearly a technology that is developed in many countries by people of many different nationalities all at the same time. And the various innovations that develop are innovations where each innovation builds on discoveries of many other people. And these slides don't mention there were many other people that were involved in the process of technological innovation to try to develop this this system of wireless communication of voice. In 1902, a method is developed for bouncing signals off the ionosphere. That is to say, the atmosphere is divided into certain levels. The Earth is round. If you need to transmit a signal over long distances, the curvature of the Earth limits the distance, limits the effective distance of a transmission if that signal has to go directly from one point to another point. This signal bounce, what signal bounce does is it allows, even though we still have curvature of the Earth, signal bounce allows for a signal to go up, bounce off the atmosphere, and down. And that can happen over long distances. So if the Earth is curved like this, we have a signal that goes up. Sorry, can't see my hand here. Up, and down, 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 and it greatly increases the effective distance that over which a signal can travel. In 1904, effective commercial services transmitting news to ships was developed. This was still transmission of Morse code, of messages that had to be encoded and decoded by people with some specialized training, not just in operating transmission devices, but also the ability to understand the code, and the code was a system of signals that corresponded to letters, generally to letters of the alphabet. In 1906, Reginald Fessenden, who was an American, developed the first transmission of the human voice, first effective transmission over radio of the human voice. In 1907, a transatlantic radio telegraph service was developed. And in 1916, the very first experimental radio station, 2XG in New York City, was developed by Lee DeForest, who was another inventor who played a significant role in the early development of radio. Without going into an incredible amount of detail about this history, and I can tell you, for the slides, just the few slides that we've covered, there are entire sections of libraries full of books covering this history. There's a great amount of detail. It's a very rich period. A few trends in the development of radio. First trend is early radio was developed by innovators and amateurs. The things that were going on, particularly the period of the 1890s to the 1910s, the innovations that were happening, a lot of them were hobbyists. People who found out about these new technologies and found out that they could build their own radio kits or acquire radio kits and begin communicating, that they could find ways to communicate with one another. Right? This is the kind of spirit that drove the early innovations. Right? As people started to realize, as inventors started to realize that there was a possibility of developing communication devices that could drastically change the way people communicated. And as hobbyists, people that were technologically minded but may not be completely on the forefront of technology, but they adopted innovations as others went before them and started playing around with them and doing different things. This is the kind of thing that drove early radio forward. In the 1910s, there was a shift, And if you know your history, the 1910s, this was a period of developing understanding of or a changing understanding of internationalism and the ways that countries were relating to one another. It was a period of increasing tensions between different international blocs of countries, and it was a period in which governments started recognizing the strategic value of radio and started stepping in and regulating radio. During World War I, what at the time was referred to as the Great War, the government in the United States, the government actually took over radio and would not allow further development of radio by amateurs or other people without government sanction. So government was controlling the radio spectrum and regulating radio specifically as a military tool at that point. After World War I, governments continued to keep a strong hand on the medium of radio. They recognized not just its strategic value as a military tool, but its potential for economic development. So governments kept a strong regulatory hand in radio from this period on. One of the big issues, and here's a slide, spectrum issues. Somehow the graphic that I had in here dropped out. I don't know how. But spectrum issues with respect to radio, it was recognized fairly early on that radio signals could interfere with one another, that a stronger signal could overpower a weaker signal, and that without some kind of agreement, some kind of management of broadcasting, it would be very difficult to develop a reliable system of radio, because there'd be too much interference for people to have any sense of being able to count on a particular signal being available at a particular time. So spectrum, the availability of spectrum, the recognition that radio had very strong military, strategic, commercial, and community values all kind of fed into the focus in early radio development on or early radio regulation on regulating the use of radio spectrum, of broadcast spectrum. After the era of World War I, after the government loosened its control over, and the United States was not the only government that was during World War I had put the radio spectrum under military control, but as our text focuses on the U.S. experience, that's where most of our attention, unfortunately, goes. So in the U.S., the development of commercial radio. So after the government loosened its control on radio as a military resource, it started to encourage the development of commercial radio, radio for commercial purposes. 1921, a radio station, WBZ, in Springfield, Massachusetts. Springfield is in the western part of the state of Massachusetts, which is the same state where Boston is located on the east coast of the U.S. This station later actually moved physically to Boston. WBZ Springfield received the very first U.S. commercial radio license in 1921. Now notice, commercial radio license. There were commercial uses of radio before this point, but they hadn't yet been licensed, and they weren't really effective commercially yet at that point. In 1922, WGY Schenectady, New Jersey. That's near New York City. Now you notice one of the reasons that early radio stations developed outside of the major cities. So Springfield is a large community, but not a large city. That's relatively far away from Boston, which is a major city. Schenectady in this period was similarly a large community, but not nearly so large as New York City. One of the reasons that radio stations are developing outside of the major cities at this point is that one of the challenges in early radio was how do you ensure that you have good radio signals when among buildings. Buildings could interfere with radio signals, and early on in the early development of radio, it was common for people to set up stations outside of the major cities so that they didn't have to deal so much with that obstacle. So this WGY Schenectady, New Jersey, their innovation, they introduced a performance group, the WGY Players, who produced and performed live radio dramas on the air. You'll remember last class we spoke a little bit. I showed you, I mentioned a movie, Brother, Where Art Thou, which came out several years ago, but which looks a little bit at the early radio era and the attempts of early broadcasters to get live performances on the air so that they would have content, so that they would have something interesting to broadcast so people would listen. Right? This WGY Schenectady in 1922 was one of the first, if not the first, station to put together its own group of performers to generate content. In other words, an early commercial model for radio was that stations themselves, the broadcasters, hired the talent to create the performances that would go on the air. Initially, radio advertising took what we call a soft sell approach. Radio was seen as an intimate medium. It was a box that was right in someone's house or apartment. People were not used to this. This was a very strange thing. In fact, there was a documentary done on radio, the early history of radio by Ken Burns, who was a documentarian who was working particularly in the 1980s in the U.S. He put into one of his documentaries a quote from this period. A broadcaster asks someone, "Well, do you have a radio in your home?" And the man says, "No, I don't." The way he says it, he says, "I don't hold with furniture that talks." early radio was seen as a piece of furniture. Early radio devices were very ornate. They were not just things that you used to listen to, but they were supposed to beautify the house. Early radio was seen as an intimate domestic medium, and this had a lot to do with how advertising was conducted on early radio. Early radio didn't really use advertisements that were separate from the content, the entertainment that was being broadcast. They didn't have a period of commercials that were separate and that were very much pushing a particular product. They had something that was a little, to modern listeners, was perhaps a little bit more strange, and to modern listeners, to many of us, perhaps a bit more intrusive. We've developed a cultural separation, an idea that we have a separation between the entertainment content, the news content, and the advertising, and that we should be able to separate these things out. In early radio, this was not the case. In early radio, advertising was, more often than not, advertising was built into the entertainment. You may have a host who is doing something that's entertaining and then moves very easily into discussing a product. There were also, in early radio advertising, sponsored programs. The term soap opera, you may have heard the term soap opera to refer to daytime broadcasts, dramas, ongoing dramas, aimed at, for a long period of time, aimed particularly at housewives. The term soap opera developed because the sponsors for the programs, more often than not, were companies that were selling products that would be of interest to housewives. And of course, soaps, detergents, cleaning products were some of these things that were being advertised. So, for instance, one of the early programs in broadcast history in the United States was Lux Radio Theater, and Lux was a company that sold soap, and they had dramas and entertainment programs, all of which were used to deliver advertising of their products to listeners. Another thing that's really interesting about radio is the rise of the radio network. As radio developed, it became clear to the companies producing radio that producing content is expensive. If a radio station has to hire people and have them produce content for delivery to audiences, you needed to have a very large audience in order to sustain that model. That meant that in developing radio stations, if the content was produced individually, station by station, that meant that economically stations would more or less be limited to broadcasting where their signals could be heard in large communities so that they could demand more money from advertisers. The innovation that came about to deal with this issue was the radio network, and that's essentially a chain of radio stations, groups of radio stations that share their content, so that instead of having individual stations develop all their own individual content, members of the same radio network could share the same programming, which could be broadcast to many different communities from different specific radio stations. Okay. In 1926, RCA and the National Broadcasting Network, which was later called NBC, established what they called red and blue networks. In 1928, Columbia Broadcast System, CBS, was developed, and in 1934, the Mutual Broadcasting Network was developed. These names are less familiar now to young people in the United States growing up than they were when I was growing up. When I was growing up in the United States, which was many years after this period, NBC and CBS were still two of the dominant broadcast networks in the United States, and they were dominant both in radio and in television. They are still very dominant or very powerful networks, but in the contemporary environment, there are so many other companies, cable casting, and sending signals in other ways that these two aren't quite so familiar to people anymore. Okay, so the importance of radio networks. Many stations in many different cities share common ownership and programming. Another issue with radio networks, when you have radio networks, lots of stations owned by one company, what happens is you get fewer individual voices in broadcasting. And this has the effect of reducing diversity, reducing the sense of different voices being available in the community. This was an issue that was of some concern to early regulators, in the United States, and they took steps to ensure that through a broadcast license that there was some responsibility on the part of broadcasters to make space on their networks for voices of people who are not necessarily employees or not necessarily in agreement with some of the things that the station was broadcasting. The development of radio networks also helped to promote the idea of radio as a commercial medium. More radio networks suggest, that the commercial concerns underlying radio are the way forward, and regulators simultaneously, regulators were insisting on making space. They were insisting on radio being primarily a commercial medium, with some spaces. Excuse me, with some spaces that would be set aside either through time on a commercial station or by the creation of non-commercial stations. So there were some ways that space was set aside. in radio for non-commercial voices. Okay, let's bring this back a little bit to Clay Shirky and the initial arguments that we heard in the course from Clay Shirky. Radio networks extend the influence of a few broadcasters in forming ever larger groups within a particular country, generally. Radio networks help extend the opportunity for broadcasters to participate in the formation of groups by putting the same or very similar information in front of large numbers of people. Okay, I'm going to take a very quick 30-second break to get a drink, and then I'll be back with you. Okay, I'm back. Just a little pause here. I told you at the beginning I really like radio, and I think radio is very important, and I think that's reflected in the amount of time I'm taking going through this presentation. So, given the amount of time we have, we may not actually get to television today at all, and if not, then I'll accommodate and speed things up. But I'll try to go a little bit more quickly through the material for the rest of the time I have today. A very important piece of legislation in radio history was the Radio Act of 1927. In the mid-1920s, the majority of frequencies, and when I say frequency, that's every radio station, every broadcast system has to go through a particular frequency, which tells us where on the spectrum that signal will be broadcast. So in the mid-1920s, the majority of frequencies were run by small businesses, not big businesses. One third of the frequencies were run by churches, schools, and nonprofit organizations. In other words, early radio broadcasting at least, was characterized by many different stations, many different voices that occupied small portions of the spectrum, took up relatively little space, and relatively speaking, were limited to small communities, small areas of broadcast. In 1927, the Radio Act of 1927 established the FRC, the Federal Radio Commission in the United States. And this commission was responsible for regulating frequencies, particularly for regulating frequencies to correct problems of competition over signals, where there was bad reception in an area because more than one radio station was broadcasting in the same frequency. The government decided it was essential for the interests of developing the potentials of the new technology for government to step in and regulate and say there are rules. We're putting rules in place that say what portion of the spectrum you can use, what your responsibilities are as someone who uses that spectrum, and so on. The new regulations favored commercial users, especially networks, over non-commercial users. In other words, the government made a strategic choice in developing radio, basically saying we put our backing behind the large companies that own networks, broadcast networks, for a variety of reasons. You know, one reason was that they were the ones best positioned to help develop the new medium. If you look at testimony around this issue in the era, there were other reasons as well. The idea that America is about business, and so therefore we should be promoting business and not promoting social agendas. That the technology should fund itself and not be something that has to be funded by supporting nonprofit organizations and things of that nature. The majority of frequencies were allocated to networks. A small minority, only 2%, were allocated to non-commercial users. This is a very big shift. You notice in the mid-1920s, one-third of the frequencies were used by non-commercial users, churches, schools, nonprofit organizations. And that was reduced to only 2% in 1927. At this point, some of the non-commercial users formed the National Committee on Education by Radio to lobby government about the idea of the radio spectrum, the airwaves, as a public resource. In other words, the logic behind this is the airwaves are not owned by anybody. Nobody can actually capture them except by broadcasting through them. The argument that they made, the argument that these groups made, which was an argument that had force in radio and television regulation into the 1980s in the United States, was that radio spectrum is a public resource, and it's a public resource that's limited. There's only a certain amount of it. So therefore, it should be regulated in a way that ensures that public interests are protected. We talk about the golden age of radio. This is the era from about 1930 to the mid-1950s. This is an era in which radio became the dominant medium in the United States, replacing magazines and newspapers. Radio was an intimate medium. It was in people's homes. It was a free medium, the way it was developed in the United States. This wasn't true of some other countries like Britain. In the United States, if you bought a radio set and had access to a signal, you didn't have to pay any. There was no mechanism in place for requiring people to pay to receive a signal. Instead, broadcasters had to find other ways to fund their broadcasting. For commercial users, for commercial broadcasters especially, this was advertising. Programming. The programming that was developed for radio started encouraging listeners to sort of plan their lives around the dial, as the quote in the text says. Radio began to schedule programming so that people would have a sense of when programs were happening, and it started to become very common for families to gather around the radio to hear particular programs at particular times. Advertising expanded in this period. Commercial programming expanded. And there was a move toward targeting specific audience demographics. We talked already about daytime soap operas. There was also broadcasting of sporting events that was aiming at different demographics and so on. Radio also developed, it was in this golden age of radio that the idea of prime-time family programming was developed. That's the idea that at particular times of day when most of the family is available, you need to have programming available that appeals to all people in the family. I've put a few slides here that show some of the areas of radio genres that were developed in this era. I mentioned previously the Lux Radio Theater. The Lux Radio Theater, one of the things that they did was to take to adapt for radio programming that was currently in movies. So you see this slide here for the film Dark Victory, which was starring Bette Davis and I believe Clark Gable. This was a big movie hit in this era. I believe it was in the 1930s. And Lux Radio Theater, now what they would do would be to use the same stars that were part of the movie production and produce a shorter version of the story for radio. This did a couple of things. What it did was it drew an audience to radio because people who knew about the films would be interested and they would want to hear the broadcast. But it also increased the audience for theater, for cinema, movie theaters, because it created, for people who maybe hadn't seen the movie and got a taste of it, they could listen to the characters, listen to stories through radio, but they may be enticed then to visit the movie theater where they would pay to actually see and listen to a longer production of the story. And this kind of approach worked very well. The Lux Radio Theater was around, I think, for maybe 20 years. Another approach, if you look at the slide on the top right, this is a slide there, George Burns and Gracie Allen. Some of you may have seen pictures of George Burns. I think he died maybe a decade ago. He was a comedian, a U.S. comedian. He was very famous for always smoking a cigar, and he had, of course, very white gray hair and a kind of a raspy voice. Well, this is George Burns when he was young, and his partner was his wife, Gracie Allen, and they had a comedy program on CBS where they bantered back and forth. So they set one of the genres of comedy in radio. Vox Pop, in the lower left-hand corner, Vox Pop was a sort of what we call a man in the street program. It was a program where interviewers would talk to people at different events, ask them questions, have quizzes, that kind of thing. So audience interaction became very important in early radio, and things like game shows and interactive audience events were very important genre. And finally, news. radio really helped to develop news as a of the moment genre. People could listen to live radio events. The photo that you see here in the lower right-hand screen is of a German Zeppelin, the Hindenburg, which in the 1930s was traveling in the United States, and if I recall correctly, it was in New Jersey that there was an accident in which the Hindenburg exploded. And there's a very famous audio clip of a news broadcaster who was routinely covering the launch of the Hindenburg and happened to be there when it exploded and made a very famous live broadcast of that event. A few years after the Federal Radio Commission was developed, it was changed. It was shifted to something called the Federal Communications Commission. This was established in 1934 by the Communications Act of 1934 in the United States. And what it did was it set up one organization that would that would regulate both broadcasting, which at this point was just radio, and telephony. Later on, the FCC also took on television broadcasting as well. In 1938, the Federal Communication Commission limited broadcast stations to 50,000 watts. This was a way of helping to protect spectrum, to protect a certain number of voices in the radio spectrum and not have kind of super stations that would broadcast vast distances across the country and wipe out other stations through their use of the spectrum. In 1940, they set aside a portion of the FM spectrum. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the difference between AM and FM radio. The differences between them technically have to do with the ways that each uses broadcast spectrum. They use a different section of the spectrum. AM radio is better for long distance transmission. FM radio is better for local transmission, but FM radio also usually has better sound quality than AM radio. So in the United States, when I was growing up, you'd more often hear news or talk shows or things like that on AM radio, whereas on FM radio, you'd hear sort of more high quality broadcasting that was aimed at people who really cared about the sound quality. FM became, so they set aside a portion of the FM spectrum, which is, FM spectrum is better tuned to local groups and things like that. They set aside a portion of that spectrum for public education stations. And in 1949, the very first non-commercial network was established to take advantage of this spectrum, Pacifica Network, which still broadcasts today. In 1943, the FCC took a decision, an anti-monopoly decision, which required the NBC Blue network to sell off a number of its stations. And that became, those stations formed another network called ABC. So that was sort of the moment at which what would become the three dominant radio and television networks in the United States were put into place. ABC, NBC, and CBS all in place at that time. Now, the Federal Communication was kind of balancing. They were very much concerned with developing radio and communications in general as commercial media, but they also had a mandate to protect public voices. The setting aside of the FM spectrum for public stations is part of protecting public voices. In 1949, they also established what's called the Fairness Doctrine, which essentially required broadcasters to give a certain amount of time to people to present opposing views on things that stations were broadcasting. So, for example, if a station presented an editorial on a particular issue and took a position, they had to open up space on their airwaves for people to present alternative views, different positions. Now, in practice, this is very difficult to manage, because if you imagine a radio station has only one channel through which to broadcast, and if they broadcast one message, they may get 100 people wanting to respond to that message, and those people could be representatives of groups, they could be simple community members, whoever. And the station has a certain amount of control over, a great deal of control over who to give that time to. So they could be selective. They could be relatively selective in their choices. So it's very difficult to manage something like the Fairness Doctrine in a way that actually protects the general interests of large numbers of people and diversity of voices. But it was at least something that was present in broadcasting for several decades. Okay, so on the margins, we had a system that was dominated by commercial broadcasters. The reason it was dominated by commercial broadcasters was that in 1927, the non-commercial broadcasters were pushed out through regulation. There were still opportunity for alternative voices. There were educational stations which were set aside by regulations allowing public stations in the FM spectrum and also the Fairness Doctrine. But there was also developed what are called border stations. These were mostly in Mexico, which didn't have strong regulations. A number of stations were established in northern Mexico that broadcast primarily into the United States and were not subject to regulation by the FCC. There was a station, I'm forgetting the name of the station right now, I believe it comes up later in the slides, but the photo here is of a very famous disc jockey whose nickname was Wolfman Jack. And he started his career working for one of these Mexican AM radio Mexican stations that was broadcasting popular music and broadcasting it into the United States, particularly California, Arizona, Texas, the southwestern U.S. And he became known as a trendsetter, as someone who was able to have an impact on young people's interest in new music, particularly new music. And he actually became a subject of popular culture. There was a movie that came out in the 1970s called American Graffiti, in which the kids in California were listening and heavily influenced by these broadcasts. Um, the 1950s period of radio. Now, the golden age of radio was the 1930s to the 1950s. Radio emerged as an established medium in the late 1920s. The 1930s, it became the dominant communication medium in the United States, and remained the single dominant medium until the 1950s. In the mid-1950s, early to mid-1950s was the period that radio started really to feel competition from television. This meant that in order to adapt in the mid-1950s, programming for radio started to change. So, in other words, in the golden age of radio, the programming that had developed was the kind of programming around which families would plan their lives. They'd know that a program was on at a particular time, and they'd sit down to listen, oftentimes together. This changed when television developed. Television started to be the medium that played that role, that grabbed people's attention. Television adapted many of the same approaches that were used in radio. In fact, many of the same performers that were dominant in early radio went on to reproduce their programs for television, and we'll look at that as we discuss television. This meant that radio could no longer be successful, no longer as successful with that approach to having regular programming that people would plan their lives around. That's what television started doing. So radio shifted. Radio started to turn to formats that didn't require people to follow a schedule. Radio became the medium that people would just turn on whenever, knowing that they should hear something, whether news or music, entertainment, whatever that is. So in the late 1950s, for example, there was the development of the top 40 format as people in the music industries started to see radio as a vehicle to promote music. Radio started to step in as a medium. Many stations, music-related stations, would just play music throughout the day so that anybody could turn on the radio at any time and they would know they would hear a particular format of music. It's a very big cultural shift that happened with radio. FM, now FM was established earlier on, but FM really developed as a quality format in the 1960s. As the technology behind FM radio developed, listening devices now in the 1960s, it became, well, actually, listening to radio in cars was something that developed starting in the 1940s. But radio became more and more popular for listening both at home and in cars in this era. The cost of radio devices came down, so that no longer would people have a single device, for example, in the living room, but you'd have radios in a variety of places. Transistor radios. The radios became smaller and smaller and portable. People could carry radios around. So this changed the experience listening to radio, because a radio became something that you could have around at all times, whether you were in a car, which had a radio in it, or whether you were just going around carrying a radio with you. The rise of national public radio, of public radio, the National Public Radio Network, affiliates and independents really took off in the 1970s. Sort of a combination of improved technology that made radios cheaper, more accessible, better quality listening, and the rise of different funding models that helped promote public radio. And actually, when I say funding models, it's not. It was government support for public radio that really helped public radio take off, particularly in the 1970s. This was a response to some of the stresses of the 1960s, cultural stresses that were going on internationally, that resulted in governments taking an interest in establishing and supporting broadcasting that was not just commercial, but would help with cultural development and give an opportunity for people to engage with social issues in more constructive ways, rather than not. We're going to jump forward with this last point on the slide, with the rise of conglomerates. From the 1990s on, the 1980s in the United States saw the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine was removed from the FCC's mandate, and the government in this period decided that it was less urgent for government to be concerned with things like monopoly and diversity. Technology had developed at this point to allow for many different stations in broadcasting, and cable television, cable communications had developed to allow many more stations to coexist than was possible in the broadcast spectrum with television. And so government sort of stepped back and said, well, we protect diversity in broadcasting by having technologies that allow for many different radio and television stations, and that means there's no longer a need for government to step in and ensure that particular voices are protected. So this saw the rise of conglomerates, large companies that own many different stations in many different places, and the establishment of one particular company called Clear Channel, which had a strategy of owning stations nationwide and broadcasting on those stations, owning many stations in many different communities. This slide just deals with a number of the different formats that have developed in popular radio, country, news, talk, information, adult contemporary. These are all formats that have their own audiences, and from my perspective, I just put them forward mostly so that you can compare them with your experience. You may have seen in Korea, you may have very different types of formats. There are some key issues involved with radio and culture that go throughout the history of broadcasting. In some ways, radio has served as audio newspaper. Radio has served to give large numbers of people common experience of events. One of the things that has been said about radio is that it helped overcome illiteracy, both as a teaching device and as something to promote people's interest in news. An example of radio and culture is the War of the Worlds. This was mentioned in some detail in our text. This was an example of a radio broadcast, a fictional radio broadcast that people thought was real, which resulted in some widespread panic in the 1930s. Radio entered politics, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president in the United States from the era of the Great Depression, the early 1930s, until the end of World War II, for about a dozen. I think he was president for 12 years. Maybe longer than that, if I'm remembering correctly. But he recognized the importance of radio for politics and made very effective use of what were called fireside chats, where he addressed public audiences through radio, and this went on for throughout his administration. I mentioned the development. Now, the development of talk radio was a format. We didn't format of radio in which people talk, allow for audience participation in radio programs through call-in. This is an important innovation in radio. And I mentioned the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine. This came in 1987, and this was something that resulted in or is seen largely responsible for the development of more political programming, more what we call shock jocks, people who try to shock audiences. This is not just a result of the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, but it's also a result of the loosening of laws related to the regulations related to what you can and can't say on the radio for risk of offending people. That came up largely because of competition from cable broadcasting. Some recent radio innovations, which we'll only mention briefly here, they are things to keep in mind as we move toward the internet era. That's the development of satellite radio, which greatly expanded the ability of one station to be picked up in many different places, and it changed the ways that people consume radio. Now oftentimes people subscribe to satellite broadcasts, which they pay for by subscription. Digital radio has also changed the quality of radio, changed the delivery methods. Radio is now delivered not just through broadcast, but through cable signals, satellite signals, and on the internet. And I think a very important innovation online, and it's an innovation that starts to bring us back and make space again for hobbyists in the radio industry, is the rise of podcasting. In which people who have small amount of skills, access to a computer, an internet connection, recording device are able to essentially to broadcast their own audio or video broadcast that can be shared with many other people. Okay, we've come to the end of our section on radio. I apologize, I haven't gotten to television. I will get to that next week and try to catch up. I will talk to Ken about our strategy for catching us up. I do recall last year going through this same discussions with Ken as we needed to adjust for the amount of time we spent on different topics. So I want to thank you all for your attention, and I hope you all have a good week. And I believe we'll be taking a 10-minute break now, and Ken will come back and be with you. So Ken, can you confirm that, please? Okay, great. So Ken confirms. We'll take a 10-minute break now. Ken will be with you after that, and I will see you next week. So thank you all very much.
Okay, so Cece was to present movies, and it sounds like Frederick's going to talk about television next week. He might talk about movies also. So if Viola can be ready for next week, for sure, because I'm pretty sure he's going to cover TV, and then if Cece's ready also, then we'll just do both of them. No matter what Frederick does, we'll just get caught up and do both then. Okay. I have sent you all, just during the first part of this session, of this class, I sent you all some feedback on your first creative project. And for those of you who have done presentations, feedback on your presentations. With one exception, I think one of you used with your creative project, used a text format that I could not open. And anyway, just send that again. If you can change that to text or whatever, I can't remember. I think that was you on, I think, sent it to me in a text I couldn't open. Anyway, just get that to me as soon as possible, and we'll get that finalized. So today is the 20th, and so just looking ahead to see when the next creative project isn't due for a while, so we're okay with that. I know some of you are already working on your creative project as a team. I've gotten some emails, and that's good. That's good. Okay, so it sounds like it's pretty much up to me to take the rest of the time then. I was thinking that we had a student presentation, but that's not right now. So I'm going to go ahead and upload a presentation and actually maybe go through part of 2 of them. So let me see. First off, I didn't look to see which one was better. These 2 of them are kind of similar. I'll go ahead and do this one, and then I created an update that I may do next week or whatever. Okay, so let me turn off the pen. I don't think I need that. So this this covers mostly broadcasting. Some of it covers some other aspects of this, what I call the second internet revolution. So I'm going to go through this PowerPoint with you. There are, I think I'll turn that off. I'll leave it on, I guess. Expand this a little bit. Okay, so I may have talked about this a little bit before. I don't think I did in great detail, but what I would call the first internet revolution was highlighted by Obama. And this is, I'm looking at this from a from a real, I guess maybe I'm looking at this mostly from a marketing perspective in some ways, because marketing kind of drives the world. Advertising drives the world. Business drives the world. And so until the Obama election, there was very gradual growth of the internet from a commercial perspective. And in fact, there was perhaps more, there was called we had the boom and then the bust. In the late 1990s, there had been a lot of money invested into internet, and with the really starry-eyed vision of what could happen very quickly, and it went bust. A lot of companies went out of business. There was just more enthusiasm than there was substance at that time. Not enough people. Basically, advertising and the audience go together. If you don't have enough audience spending enough time getting exposed to advertising, then advertising won't be sold. And so with all media, including online media, that's a real key for how things will develop. But with the Obama election, he started using social media particularly and the internet overall in a revolutionary way. And that's why I would call that the first revolution. Others would disagree possibly, but that's the way I see it. Because of his use of the social media and the internet, he was able to gather twice as much money in donations than his Republican opponent. And actually his Republican opponent, if it had not been for Obama, would have set a record for the most money ever raised. And yet Obama raised twice as much as he did. And so this whole election process has been revolutionized in a very dramatic way and made much more expensive. In the last election, Obama and Romney both spent nearly around $1 billion each, which is no small sum. And so he didn't have quite that much. Obama had over $800 million in his first election, and McCain, his opponent, had a little over $400 million. So again, almost twice as much in donations. He was also able to activate his millions of supporters. They followed him on the social media and followed him on his website. And so when he said, I need help, they came to give money or to volunteer, or whatever they had to do. With only a 4% swing in the voting, Obama would not have been president. And so the fact that he only won by a relatively small amount with twice as much money and much more effective recruiting of supporters and volunteers and so forth really means, my conclusion is, the internet won the election for Barack Obama. I don't think there's any question about it. He is not really, when you look at his policies and look at his background, he does not represent mainstream America. And so it would not have taken much for him to lose. People were excited. He had written his book, and people, he offered a vision of hope that people bought into. He was charismatic. People were excited to have the first African-American president. They wanted to make history. So there are a lot of things that contributed, but he would not have been president without the internet. I think that's pretty easy to conclude. And you can see what happened then after that. So his election was 2008. And by the end of 2009, Facebook had grown 350%. And it kept growing, and it has kept growing since then. Now, that isn't all because of Barack Obama, but I think a lot of it was. People like myself, anybody in business, anybody in sales, anybody who was trying to promote something realized, wow, we can no longer ignore the internet. Many of us thought, I think most of us in the area of marketing and advertising and stuff, including myself, we knew it was coming. We knew it would have an impact someday. We really didn't believe it was ready. There were no real strong case studies of anybody really going crazy because of the internet. But that all changed in 2009 and has continued changing. The same thing happened with Twitter, except even more so. In 2008, it was hardly viable. But by 2009, it had grown 1,000% in just 1 year. So it skyrocketed. And it has also become a major tool for marketers and so forth, as well as for general communications, for sure. But again, I'm kind of looking at it from what really drives the media, and that's money, basically. So I may look at it a little differently than some of you and Frederick and so forth. But so we began seeing some changes. I talked about some of this before. The advertising, this is only as of 2010. I gave you more updated statistics last week, but you see the beginning of the collapse of the newspapers. This was just again in 2000. This is 2012, so a little bit more recent. But again, last week I gave you more up-to-date data. But this breaks down the different types of newspaper advertising. And of course, this isn't exactly TV and broadcasting yet, but we'll get to that in a second. But we see just how quickly things were dropping as of 2007. And so if you look at the very bottom, we see digital advertising was growing quite dramatically at that moment, but it was still just a very small part of advertising for newspapers. This was, we could see that a lot of the media were picking up advertising in 2010. And so people were enthusiastic. But we also see that newspapers really did not participate very much in that. In fact, they didn't participate at all. What they really saw was less of a decline. They declined 10% the previous year, and they only declined 5% in 2010. And we see the other media, television was holding its own. Internet was climbing rapidly as a proportion of all advertising sales. Radio was holding its own. Magazines had recovered quite dramatically in 2010 from the previous collapse. So this is kind of an overview of all the media here at first, and I'll talk a little more about broadcasting in a second. This is one I referred to last week. I don't remember if we actually showed this slide, but in fact, I'm sure we did not. But this again is, this compares the usage of media by different generations. The boomers, my age, on the other end the millennials, and in between the Gen X in between us. And we see that gradually with each generation, TV is being viewed less, still quite a bit, but less. Computers are being used more by everybody. Radio is being listened to less. I think that's only broadcast radio is what they're talking about in this particular slide. But anyway, we see a dramatic drop in listening to radio. Newspapers, very dramatic drop in the readership. Again, this is news consumption. Where are they going for news? Smartphone, it was increasing dramatically among the younger generation and slowly improving. The older generation is increasing also, but it's more slowly. And magazines readership is dropping somewhat slowly. The use of the smart tablet is increasing among all generations, and actually the one that the one that's using it the most for news is actually the younger generation, even though the middle generation owns more smart tabs, they don't use it as much for news. So kind of get an idea of, and as we talked about last week, as the population ages, we will see then less and less use of the traditional media because the younger generations will increasingly use mobile and other online devices. This from a marketing perspective, and we may come back to this later on when we start talking about advertising, but we see a mismatch between how much time people were spending. This is in 2011. How much time people were spending with different media and how much advertising was using, how much paid advertising was going to that medium. So we see TV was about the same. People spent about 43% of their media time on TV, and about the same amount of advertising was spent on TV. On the internet, there were more people were spending more time on the internet than advertising was being spent at that time. Radio was actually showing the mismatch also. People were listening to more radio than advertising was being purchased. But you see mobile. People were spending like 8% of their time on their mobile device, and there was almost no advertising on mobile at that time. Newspapers, a great mismatch the other direction. People were only spending 5% of their media time with newspapers, and yet they were getting about 17% of the advertising. So after a while, and magazines also was a great mismatch, less readership time than advertising was being spent. When I saw this in 2011, I started telling my students, wow, watch what's going to happen now. Because in a free market, this won't last. This is like a vacuum. It's going to suck up enterprise, innovation, and investment. Particularly in mobile. I said, watch out for mobile. You know, people are spending a lot of time on mobile, and they're not getting any advertising. Watch out. You'll see advertising in the next few years pouring into mobile because there's this, like I say, this vacuum that's going to suck it in. And that's exactly what has happened. And we'll cover that in more detail. Well, here's another related chart. This is more recent. This carries us up to 2014. So eMarketer, which kind of covers online marketing as probably closer than anybody. So they did an analysis of how much it cost per hour spent with any particular adult. So if they spent an hour in a newspaper, how much did it cost? If they spent an hour, for every hour they spent in the magazines, how much did it cost? And so forth. So you can see in 2010, with the magazines and newspapers, it was costing 53 cents per reader per hour that they spent on the newspaper. TV was a better buy, 16 cents for every hour they spent on TV. Radio was even a better buy, 11 cents for every hour people listened to the radio. Digital overall was 10 cents, so it was even better. But down in mobile was the best buy, even in 2010, if you could get it. That was, 2 cents for every hour somebody spent on mobile. Flash forward to 2014. We'll skip a few years. So now, because fewer people were reading magazines and newspapers, it is now costing 84 cents per adult per hour of them reading a magazine, and 82 cents with newspapers. TV has only increased a little bit. It's still 17 cents per hour that people spend on TV. Radio has increased a little bit, 13 cents per hour per adult. Digital is it is exactly where it was in 2014 as it was in 2010. And the increase, there's been an increased cost in mobile just because they're able to charge more, frankly. So they're selling more and they're getting more for their advertising. So, but we still see that by far the best value in advertising is mobile. And it's not just the time, the number of people using mobile, but during the same period of time, because of this vacuum I was talking about, this sucking in innovation, sucking in investment, a lot has changed since then. Of course, a lot more people have smartphones than they used to have, than they did in 2010. There are a lot more online internet entertainment providers, you might say, that are using, that have adapted to mobile. A lot more mobile friendly websites and so forth. So there's a lot has changed, and so there are more opportunities for the users of mobile to enjoy their mobile devices. There are more opportunities for advertisers to buy advertising. And so we see a lot of changes here between all the different media. And again, the strong indicator is that gradually the cost per reader for print media will make it too high, and advertisers will drop out altogether, continue to drop out slowly, and ultimately just make it unviable. And gradually it will impact other traditional media too, probably, and we'll talk about that in a second. We see in online marketing, a lot of it is not paid marketing. We have what we call content marketing, where people are using blogs and videos and ebooks and other web content to attract attention and create buzz, get people to come to their websites. They use it to achieve credibility and ultimately to convert visitors into clients. And so free promotional tools now are more available than ever and make it even cheaper to market online, because you don't necessarily have to pay for all of your marketing. A lot of it can come free. I think this is getting enough into the advertising area. I want to skip over some of the stuff. So I'm going to, in fact, I am going to go to my other slide. Well, no, I'm going to go down here. Here's where I wanted to pick up at, I think. Yeah. So part of the, because we really haven't, everything we talked about so far is talk about what I call the first internet revolution. So I want to talk about the second internet revolution and what that's all about. So the new revolution is all about video. Video and mobile. The two are intertwined. And they both took off at the same time. So make sure there's not something here I need to show you first about video. No, I don't think so. Okay, so okay, so this part is about the mobile revolution. We see that there's already, in fact, when I wrote this, I said 2 times as many mobile connections to the internet, or broadband internet connections, as there were for fixed wire, and that has increased. So we tend to still think of internet as being a computer function, but desktops are going out of business too, in a way. Like I say, there's 2 to 3 times as many mobile connections now, and with the younger generation, that's going to increase dramatically over time. And it's international, it's global, as the last point makes, is that over half of the mobile, or about half of the mobile accounts, are in emerging countries. So it's not just something that's occurring in America and Korea and Japan and more developed economies. It's also happening in India and the Philippines. And I went to Indonesia the other day, and people in little shops I was visiting all had their smartphone or their smart pad out while they were waiting for customers, accessing the internet. This is a worldwide phenomenon. And so the prediction in 2011 would be that the number of connections overall, mostly because of mobile, would by this year would double. And there would be about 2.5 connections for every man, woman, child, and baby on Earth to the internet, again because of mobile. The speed of broadband would increase, the prediction was, and it's turning into reality now, would basically quadruple during that time between 2011 and 2016. And this, getting to video, I was talking about, this is what happened just 1 year to video. Now we're getting back to broadcasting, or the idea of broadcasting. In 1 year, between June of 2011 and June of 2012, the number of videos viewed online increased by 550%. That's why I call this a revolution. And this is the second revolution. It's a combination of mobile and video. And the two, as I said, do intertwine, because one of the very first things that became mobile compatible, or with as far as online programming, was video. It was very easy to watch a video on a smartphone, whereas accessing a web page was not easy. And so immediately, as people started getting smartphones, they started watching video on smartphones. And so I'd say that's probably the big driver for why it increased 550% in 1 year, was because smartphones and smart pads and so forth were increasing to dramatically during that same period of time. But there was also, as I mentioned, increased speed. And so I was watching a lot more videos in 2012 than in 2011, even on my desktop, because the quality of video improved dramatically during that period of time. The software that the servers on the internet used was improved dramatically to become more video friendly. Just the overall bandwidth improved. And so everything combined, a perfect storm, as they say, between the increase of mobile devices, the increase in broadband speed, the improvement of software, all led to a revolutionary increase of video in 2012. That's just kind of reiterating. Also, advertising started to grow, not as quickly as the video views. Again, there was kind of a vacuum being created. But in that 1 year, video embedded advertising grew 68%. And so advertising began to start following the audience to the internet and to the mobile devices. We, again, looking at from a marketing perspective, in this survey, the one thing that most executives agreed to is that video is still the most powerful type of advertising. And so we will see increasing movement towards video because it is the preferred advertising vehicle. And so we're going to see a lot of innovation, a lot of change in the future with video, online video, if only because of marketing. But it won't be just because of marketing. The reason marketing prefers video is that we prefer video. And so they're going to follow us into video. So again, from a marketing perspective, the most important content now is video. Just as kind of a case study, just looking at Kazakhstan during that period of time, this is what is happening here. We see that the internet in Kazakhstan in 2008, 73% of it was by dial-up still, flow dial-up. This one is from 2011, just 3 years later. Now suddenly, you're starting to get more mobile connections, DSL connections, There's still quite a bit of dial-up, but that was half as much as just 3 years earlier. So we started seeing a dramatic change in how people were accessing the internet in Kazakhstan, which is one of the lesser developed countries. We have a lot of villages here that will probably never have wired internet in a lot of the Kazakhstan villages because they're going mobile. They can get mobile internet easily now throughout the country. I think in almost 100% of the country. That's been a high goal and priority for the government because they recognized it was a lot cheaper to create mobile access to the internet than it was to string wires across the country. That just wasn't going to happen. And so we're going to skip a generation of technology in Kazakhstan. And we're going straight from from the dial-up connection, basically, and in many parts of the country, going straight to mobile. So again, we see rapid internet growth, skyrocketing trend line, rapid growth in broadband, much more mobile. In fact, it's kind of whited out here for some reason. I don't know if I whited it out or darkened it out for some reason. But in one website I saw, it said that the penetration rate of mobile now in Kazakhstan is 180%. I don't know if people do this in Korea, but in Kazakhstan, most of us have two vendors. We have two mobile phone providers. I do it mainly because my wife and my friends insist on it, that they get cheaper rates if they go from one user of within one system. So Beeline is one of our providers, and so if somebody calls another Beeline user using Beeline, then it costs much less than if they cross companies. And so the most popular type of mobile phone here is one that will take at least two SIM cards, so they can have two phone lines at the same time. And they very frequently even change those two lines. Sometimes some people have 3 or 4 SIM cards. So I don't know if it's that way in Korea. I'd be interested in knowing. Maybe somebody can text me if that's the trend there. But here everybody has more than one SIM card. So that's reflected by the fact that there's a 180% penetration rate. So in other words, it's 100% would be everybody has a mobile phone. 180% means everybody has 2 mobile phones in essence. So that's the reality of Kazakhstan. And so that's a great trend line, obviously, and is, again, the reason why they will be skipping a generation of technology in much of the country, particularly the smaller villages. We see a comparison. This is older information too, but this is kind of compares how much people are dependent on a mobile phone. So the first column is what percentage of them use a smartphone daily, and what percentage use it when they have time, so to speak. And what we saw, and then again, this is a couple of years old because it's probably much higher than this now, but at that time when this survey was done, Chinese university students were accessing their smartphones daily much more than U.S. students, because U.S. students also probably had, a laptop and access to a desktop, and they had more ways of accessing, and so they weren't taking the smartphone as seriously as many people overseas. So this is the second internet revolution from my perspective. I guess that's the end of this slide. I'm going to change to another slideshow real quick. Just a real quick one that updates broadcasting per se, what's happening in broadcasting. And this one I'll need to upload from my computer. Okay, so again, this is a fairly short PowerPoint. I actually just created this, just took a few minutes after I got done reviewing all of your assignments and sending those back to you. I went to some of the research I did this last year for this book that I'm co-authoring, and to look at some of the new data that's showing up. So where are we? There we are. Okay, so just want to cover a few slides on broadcasting in the internet age, and since we'll probably still be talking about it next week, I may further update this this slideshow. This goes back. I wasn't thinking about showing you that that other slide. Basically, the same slide previous that I had a chart on in the other slideshow. So this just again, but emphasizes the change, the difference between boomers and millennials and TV. Big drop off in their access of news and radio. Big drop off. Computer, millennials using it more. Tablet, millennials using it more. Smartphone, using it a lot more. So those again are the trends that affect broadcasting. This is some of the new data I collected for this book, and let me turn off the drawing tool. It gets in the way all the time. 91% of all Americans over 12 still listen to broadcast radio. But 53% of Americans also listen to online radio. So again, we're seeing a movement to online radio that may and probably almost certainly will impact broadcast radio fairly dramatically over the next few years. 73% of the online users or listeners of radio are using their smartphones. And 61, obviously it's overlapping, an overlapping 61% are using other internet devices. But 73% is by far the most popular way of listening to online radio is with smartphones. So again, as the trend towards smartphones and mobile devices increases, so will the movement of the audience to those smart devices and away from the traditional media. The ad revenues for broadcast radio are dropping about 3% per year, and so they again are, if not as quickly, they're not in as much danger as newspapers, as we covered last week, but they are getting there. And they are, I didn't put it in here, but the radio stations, the broadcast radio stations that are also transmitting, you might say, on the internet, are not getting much ad revenue yet from their online radio. So that's not good. That's same as radio. They're having a hard time moving advertisers from their traditional method of distribution to the new method of distribution. And this could especially kill the local radio stations because people will go to the internet for more global radio services and won't necessarily feel drawn to their local radio station. So that could mean the demise of the local radio station in America and other parts of the world, probably the entire world eventually. Podcast, you might say, is a different type of radio. It is, I was tempted to think a few years ago that, or at least a year ago, I don't know, whenever I was thinking this, that podcasting was going out of style, but it does not seem to be. And frankly, I listen to a lot of podcasts. It's a certain genre that I listen to, but almost every morning I listen to podcasts, sometimes in the afternoon, but usually in the morning. So I'm still using it, so I don't know why I thought it was falling out of favor. But just one company, Libsyn, I think it stands for Liberated Syndication or something like that. They host 22,000 different podcast sites, and from which there were 2.6 billion downloads in 2014. So I would say podcasting is alive and well, and is also a challenge to traditional radio as we know it. Some other trends, I think some of these I already talked about. So I wasn't thinking I would use both PowerPoints. So we were talking about the explosion of the video consumption, and we already covered that. This one we probably did not cover. Let me enhance this a little bit. Let me see it a little better. This one right here we did not cover. The revolution in part is being driven by the speed of mobile broadband. I already mentioned that. By 2019, so this is more updated information than in that other slide, Cisco projects that 97% of all mobile traffic will be via smartphones, and overall data traffic on mobile, driven by video demand, will increase 1,000%. So again, this is a 2015 projection by Cisco. So again, we see that these two trends are intertwining. The increase of mobile and the increase of video are going hand in hand as we go into the future. I think the other ones we already covered in the previous PowerPoint. Some other data, though, that I gathered for the book. This is the change in the cable news audience. So we see that it is dropping gradually. 2009, they had, this is in thousands, so they had in America, this is cable in America, had about an average median throughout the day. Their average throughout the day was about 2.2 million listeners, and that has dropped until 2014, it's dropped down to about 1.8 million. So we see the cable news audience is shrinking. They are trying to move as best they can to the internet, so get away from just cable and get online. We see that with their online, that most of their online visitors are by mobile. The blue line here is the desktop access to their online content, and in the black line, the black column, is their mobile access. And so you see significantly, in most cases, the only exception is CNN News, and America has more desktop access viewers, you might say, than mobile, but everybody else is quite dramatically more mobile than desktop. So again, from showing the trend line towards mobile. This is just to kind of understand the dynamics of American TV. They are losing regular advertising, but they've been prospering recently by what they call retransmission fees. When a cable network comes into a community, they are typically required to carry the local TV station. And if they carry the local TV station, then they have to pay a retransmission fee to that local station. And so those retransmission fees have been growing and are projected, I think possibly erroneously so. This is the projection into the future, just that, a projection. And I'll tell you in a second why I think it's an error. But the retransmission fees have been growing rapidly, and so actually this a number of TV stations were sold in the last year or so, the last couple of years, for record prices. And so for those of us who are looking at the movement of traffic or movement online of viewers, we're thinking this is stupid. You should not be paying a lot of money for these TV stations that are going to go broke soon. But they're being tempted by these retransmission fees because they're growing. And the projection again, this one expert is saying they're going to keep growing. Hold on a second. Maybe not so. Not so fast. This was a survey done by a company called Blue Shift in conjunction with SurveyMonkey. Some of you may be familiar with SurveyMonkey, where you can do surveys for free. And they asked people. First off, they saw a dramatic change already, and I didn't have a chart for that. And I'll get you that information next week. But I believe they had, in the last 6 months, they had 10% of the people had stopped their cable, paying for cable, and they had gone to the internet. Now, in some cases, they were paying for the internet, so they were paying for things like Hulu, and I don't know what companies you have in Korea, but Hulu is popular in the United States. Netflix is very popular. I get Netflix here now in Kazakhstan. I was happy to just a couple of months ago they announced last summer it was not available, but just a couple of months ago Netflix became available here, so I can get my American TV viewing in. But anyway, they asked people how likely they were to drop their regular cable pay TV type option. So it might not be cable per se. It might be a satellite, like Dish, satellite service, but anything that was offline. And 4% said they were extremely likely. Over 6% said they were very likely. Almost 11% moderately likely. Almost 90% slightly likely. And 60% not likely. Well, when things start to snowball, we talked about the tipping point last week, and I was going to include that slide here again in this one, but forgot to. But as you remember, to me the better analysis was the guy pushing a ball up the hill, a heavy round ball up the hill, and then when it got to the top, it started going rapidly down the other side. Probably the illustration I used last week was more like that. I tend to think of it more like a cup. If I can get it over here. This is I don't drink coffee, but my coffee cup that I have apple juice in. And if you tip a cup and tip a cup and tip a cup and don't hold it, then it comes to a certain point where it's going to fall over. So to me, that's the best illustration, is a tipping cup where you tip and tip and tip, and finally it gets off balance enough. It doesn't go gradually down. It suddenly falls over. And so the tipping point, I believe, is coming. And I think this reflects the tipping point. And these people that are not sure right now are suddenly going to go. And they're going to tell their friends, oh, gee, we're getting a better deal off of Hulu or off of Netflix. And those people are going to go. And I think just the same as we saw a tipping point in newspapers 10 years ago, we're in the middle of a tipping point right now. This is a demonstration of a tipping point. If all these people say they're slightly likely going to cancel their pay TV, even if it takes them more than 6 months, that's 40% of the viewers right there. And that's without any real, like I say, additional momentum that could build as people start doing it, telling their friends about it, and so forth. It will become more popularized and can happen very, very, very quickly. So I think we're in the middle of a tipping point right now. Okay, I guess that was my last slide. I kind of threw this together rather quickly, and we'll be talking TV next week, so I'll probably expand on this, maybe show you a few of these again, but expand on it with some more information. I guess the bottom line to me, though, and the message is that, you know, the dramatic impact of the internet is its impact on traditional media is not over by any means. The misconception by newspapers 10 years ago that everything would be okay. I think I mentioned the Washington Post. There's a video on from the former executive editor of the Washington Post online. And he was talking about how in 1 year, I think probably 2006, something like that, he didn't really mention the year, so I'm a little confused as to which year he was talking about. But in 2006, I believe, they were still making like record profits. They were making very good money to the extent that they hired more people in the newsroom. They had about 900 people in their newsroom with the Washington Post. It's not a small newspaper. So if you can imagine 900 journalists working for the Washington Post, and they were adding people in 2006, let's say. Again, I'm not sure exactly which year he was referring to. And then suddenly the tipping point arrived. And it took them totally by surprise. They knew it was coming. They knew it was coming. They simply did not understand the tipping point. They did not understand the nature of the tipping point as it applies to the internet. We're seeing tipping point illustrations all the time on the internet. Certainly it relates to businesses, and I think we'll see the tipping point. As I said, I think we're at the tipping point right now for broadcast TV, and that they're going to be hurting very badly in the coming year or two, just like newspapers did 10 years ago. And I think the fact that people are buying TV stations at record prices shows the same thing that the executive editor of the Washington Post was saying. They just don't understand the tipping point. They think all is well. We're making money. It's going to be this way for the foreseeable future. It'll decline gradually, and we will move our operation online gradually, and everything will be okay. Well, that's not true for the newspapers. Nowhere close to true for the newspapers. And I think we're going to see the same thing with TV. The networks, the big American networks, NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox, the networks may be able to transfer and still make a profit on the internet because they're the provider of the original programming that people want to watch. Netflix and Hulu have to pay them to show their programming. So the networks will probably survive. The local TV stations are the ones that probably won't survive. They're dependent on the networks for their programming, and they simply, as they lose advertising, they simply will not be able to function any longer. As I said, the same as newspapers, they are not picking up, they're not making the transition online well enough. They're not moving advertisers over to the internet. Same as newspapers are not, TV's not, radio's not. The traditional media is having a very hard time, especially in the local level, moving their advertising onto the internet. So I don't see much better results for TV than there were for the newspapers. I think it looked pretty dire for them. But we'll see. The next few years will tell us a lot. As I said, I think we're at the tipping point now for TV. That's my projection. And I'm feeling pretty confident about that projection, looking at this chart. Besides that, then do you all have any questions or anything? Is there anything we need to talk about? Because like I said, that's the end of my presentation. Maybe just in the next minute or two, what is your response to this? What do you expect to happen? I've told you what I think. What do you think? What's the future of traditional media? I know some of you have told me before that you love to read printed material, that you prefer printed material over reading with the smart pad or whatever, and so do I. But I think my own Well, I think a couple of things. I think that new devices will develop that will make it more that I will like reading with a smart tablet or something, or some sort of new device. I actually designed a device that I would like to have, but I've never successfully marketed it to a manufacturer, but I might still try. Because I still think my device is better than anything on the market, frankly, what I designed more than 10 years ago. If I had the device that I designed, I would be reading online all the time. I think people will make that transition, and even if they don't, the problem is the advertising. The newspapers lose advertising. They can't, even though there's a lot of us that prefer to read a printed newspaper or a printed magazine or a printed book. I think particularly books. I don't read printed newspapers very much anymore, and I don't read printed magazines very much anymore. For those, I go online. I feel comfortable going online for those because I'm not reading very much. I'm reading a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit somewhere else. And that to me is okay to do that on the internet. I'm not as excited to read a book on the internet with the devices I have currently. So, you know, my attitude might change, but regardless, I think the print media will change. Any thoughts? Again, Phil, I'd like to hear your comments if you have any. If not, we'll go ahead and end this class, and we will see you next week. And I'm looking forward to the presentation by Cece and Viola, and talking then some more about TV. Probably since there'll be 2 presentations next week, I won't have much chance to talk, so I'll maybe add a little bit more from my recent research, and maybe give you some more evidence of us reaching the tipping point. But anyway, I look forward to listening to the student presentations next week. So thank you, and have a good week. And again, I emailed most of you the results of your presentations, those that have made presentations already, and then all but one of you your first creative project. Okay, so again, thank you.